All right, the point of this video is to go over the 9 foundational documents that you have to know for the AP tests. In a normal year, you'd have to worry about these for multiple choice questions, but they're also really obviously important for the argumentative essay, which is usually FRQ number 4. If you don't know the foundational documents, you're not going to be able to write that particular essay. So we're going to try and see if we can't review them real quick. And remember, you have notes to kind of go over these throughout the course of the year. So the first one is Declaration of Independence, which is kind of a no-brainer. You understand this was written by Jefferson, and it sort of lays out our reasons for why we're declaring our independence from Britain prior to the Revolutionary War. It lists all the specific grievances against King George III, like reasons why we're revolting. And it definitely focuses on a couple things you need to know about. Number one, that we as citizens have like natural rights, inalienable, meaning can't be taken away, rights that you have. Jefferson refers to those as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But these aren't like original ideas. These are heavily influenced by Locke's social contract theory, which was the idea that people willingly give up some of their freedom to governments, to join governments, in exchange for protection from the government. And that's sort of a deal that goes on between citizens and the government. But if at any point the government starts taking away like your life, your liberty, and Locke said property, Jefferson said pursuit of happiness, you then have the right to sort of revolt and form a new government. And that's like the whole basis of the Declaration of Independence is establishing the social contract theory and then showing specific grievances against the king that show examples of how King George III violated the social contract theory. So that's the Declaration. The Articles of Confederation is obviously our first government. You don't need to know a whole lot about the particulars of the document. Just know about the articles, and that'll kind of help you with what you need to know about the document. It's our first government that's formed after independence and before the new government under the Constitution. It's what we refer to as a loose league of friendship, meaning the 13 states sort of are all still acting independently from one another. And every once in a while, will come together to deal with issues that impact all of them. The states sort of maintain sovereignty, which is like their individual power and control, that they have the ability ultimately to make almost all of the decisions for their own people. The national government is very weak in the system. Remember, there's only one branch in this government, just legislative branch. There's no executive branch. Remember, they're afraid of like a king, and there's no judicial branch. So the states have their own court systems, but there is no national court system. The legislative branch that is formed under the Articles of Confederation is unicameral. I mean, there's only one house, not like the bicameral system we have today with two houses. And unlike today, back then, every state had one vote regardless of the size of the state. Also, there were many limitations and weaknesses of things that like the Congress could not do, that were major problems that had to be fixed. Congress could not tax, they could not raise an army, and they couldn't really settle disputes between the states. So this was a major, major problem. These are all weaknesses that had to be fixed ultimately by the Constitution. All right, so the Constitution is the next document. Remember, originally when the founding fathers went to Philly in 1787, they were supposed to just be revising the article system, unbeknownst to pretty much anybody else. These founding fathers, which were a minority of obviously people in this country, basically blew the whole article system up and rewrote the government under the new Constitution. This government's different in that it establishes 3 branches. There is obviously an executive, a legislative, and a judicial branch, and the legislative branch is bicameral, meaning it has 2 houses, a House of Reps and a Senate. There's obviously a lot of differences you need to brush up on between those two. And that was obviously part of the Great Compromise. There are some major points that this new government is founded upon. The idea of separation of powers, that the different parts of government are all sort of divided up amongst the different branches. Congress makes the laws, the executive branch enforces them, and then the judicial branch sort of like deals with disputes that may arise about the laws. Checks and balances, you definitely need no specific examples of this. Every branch has certain tools that they can use to prevent other branches from abusing their power. Brush up on those. The idea of federalism, that we don't just have separation of powers on the national level, but we also divide power between the national government and the states. And then the idea of national supremacy, which we'll talk about again in a second, but that in the Constitution system, the national government is supreme, not the states. All of the amendments are fair game. If you're going to talk about the Constitution as potential foundational document you want to use, clearly the Bill of Rights, probably the most significant. are sort of added as that compromise for the anti-federalists, and there's going to be a whole separate video that you can brush up on the amendments on. And then particular clauses in the Constitution that you would want to sort of focus on. The Supremacy Clause, which basically states that any dispute between the national government and the states, if there's a conflict, the national government's usually going to win that fight. This prevents sort of like the 50 states from all pulling in different directions. Really, the national government has final say. We talked about the necessary and proper clause. We did federalism. In Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, it lists all of the things that the national government can do. And then the last power is anything that's necessary and proper to carry out the above powers. And this is often used by the government to stretch its power, sometimes nicknamed the Elastic Clause. And basically what this says is the government can generally do things that are not listed in the Constitution as long as they link it up to something that is. And the thing they usually link it up to is commerce, which is economic power, the Commerce Clause, because commerce is so broad and so vague, and really you can link anything up to the Commerce Clause. Obviously, within the amendments themselves, there's some clauses. The Free Exercise Clause and the Establishment Clause are both in the First Amendment, and the Equal Protection Clause in the 14th Amendment. And then we get into some of the specific Federalist Papers. It is important that you should focus on the Federalist Papers and keep them straight. So Federalist number 10 is written by Madison. Right? This should say all about factions. This Federalist paper is all about factions. That's the key word. Remember, factions are just different groups of people within the government, within a country, citizens that like sort of have different beliefs about the government. So Madison basically said these things are inevitable, that people are going to divide up into groups, and that there's really two options in how you deal with factions. Either you can sort of remove the causes by destroying liberty and freedom, which is not a great option, or you get rid of all differences of opinion in a country, which not really a practical option either. So the best way to deal with this is you sort of control the effects of factions, and this is a much better option. And this is sort of like the key point that Madison writes about when it comes to our new government. He's looking at the new government in its size as like the glass is half full kind of approach. That the large size of the new government, especially like a government like the United States, is definitely better than a smaller republic. And these are the reasons why. In a bigger government, you're going to have more potential leaders to choose from. So just playing the odds, you're just going to have a better possible pool of candidates to choose from. Also, you're going to have more voters voting. So the likelihood of like really any one corrupt politician being able to like dupe or trick all of these voters is sort of unlikely. And how it relates to factions is this. It's important to note that Madison is not against factions. The idea is that in a larger government, there will be more factions, more people, more factions. And with more factions, this reduces the likelihood that any one faction will be able to dominate power. So his opinion of the government is that this country is going to be a really large government. It's going to have lots of differences of opinion. And because you're going to have lots of different factions, it's really going to prevent any one of those factions from sort of like taking control. All right, Bruce number 1 is sort of the anti-federalist paper that sort of is the comparison piece to Fed number 10. This is sort of the opposite of Federalist number 10. We're not 100% sure, but we think this is written by the Federalist, anti-Federalist Robert Yates. And this is all about how this new government is going to be awful, a disaster. This is really the glass is half empty approach to looking at the new government. He's looking at some of the parts of the new Constitution, like the Supremacy Clause and like the Necessary and Proper Clause, and he's looking at those things going like, I know that at some point in the future, the national government is going to use these things to take advantage of the states and take power away from the states, and that concerns him. And if you look at the way history played out, he was probably right. He was also very much concerned about this new government's ability to like tax the citizens and thought that the government would abuse those powers as well. And the major thing that he compares with Federalist 10 is that he also focuses on the size of this new country, this new government, but he looks at the size as a negative, that this government is going to be way too large, that the representatives are going to be way too separated from the people, too far away from the people, and that the people really are going to be so different that like how would these reps really know what the people wanted and how could they adequately represent them? So at the end of the day, the reps would just end up doing what benefits them, not the citizens, because that would be too difficult. So that concerned Yates. And the other major thing was he thought that the states were just going to be too different from one another. Like, how could the federal government come up with policies that would like benefit all of the states because the states are so different from one another? So this is really the comparison piece to Fed 10. Other Federalist Papers. Fed 51 is also written by Madison, and this is specifically written to address the concerns that people like Yates and the Anti-Federalists would have regarding on the government's ability under this new system to abuse power. So this is all about the mechanisms within the new Constitution that would sort of control the government and prevent the abuse of power. So one of the key quotes from Fed 51, one of the most famous ones, was when Madison wrote, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place control itself." So that's like the whole thesis of this document, which is, yeah, governments are formed to kind of keep control over the people because the people aren't perfect. But we also have to recognize those same imperfect people work within the government. So we also have to come up with ways to control the government itself. So how do we do it? Separation of powers. We already kind of talked about that. Give each branch the ability to do something different. Checks and balances. Each branch has the ability to stop the other branches from abusing power. Make sure you know specific examples. Even the legislative branch, like Congress itself, is even subdivided. Like the House and the Senate, they have the ability to check each other. So not only do you have checks and balances between the branches, but you have checks and balances within a branch as well. Also, Madison refers to the government as a compound republic, and it's a fancy way of saying like federalism. Not only are we dividing power and separating power between the branches, but we're also dividing power between the federal government and the state governments as well. So that's what he refers to as a compound republic. That's all about how we're going to prevent the new government from abusing its power. Fed 70 is branch specific. This one is the one that's written by Hamilton, and it focuses on the executive branch. What should the executive branch look like in the new government? The thesis of this document is that a single, strong executive is best. Hamilton uses the phrase energy. An executive with energy is necessary. So you need a strong, singular executive. And this was written in response to a lot of people that at the Constitutional Convention even had argued that there were problems with a single executive, that it was too dangerous to put power in the hands of one person. Instead, it'd be better to have like a multiple executive, having multiple presidents, multiple leaders. And Hamilton writes most of this document showing why that would be a bad idea. That single executive is better than multiple executives. And the problem with having multiple presidents would be it'd be too difficult if we had multiple presidents to assign sort of blame or give credit. Because you had three presidents, for example, something good happened, we don't know who to give the credit to. And if something bad happened, they would probably just blame each other. And would also encourage division. People would maybe line up behind individual presidents, and that might cause even more polarization. If you could believe that in our country's history, it would definitely be slow and inefficient. If you had a group of presidents that had to come to an agreement, that might take more time than just having one president make a quick decision because that president has the power to do so. So it's definitely faster to have a singular executive. Fed 70 is also branch specific. This one is also written by Hamilton, and this deals with the idea of the judicial branch. That the judicial branch is, in Hamilton's view, remember, Article 3 is the shortest of all of the branches in the Constitution. And to Hamilton, that made sense because the judicial branch was definitely the weakest of the three branches. That the judicial branch was not to be feared because it didn't possess power over the purse, meaning taxation, or power over the sword, the ability to declare war. He definitely also, despite the fact that it's not in the Constitution, argues in favor of judicial review, the idea that it's really the job of the judicial branch to settle disputes that might come up under the law that you wouldn't want, obviously, individual politicians, members of Congress, or the president deciding what is right or wrong because it might involve their own actions. You have to have an independent group like the courts. And a lot of this document writes in favor of life terms, that it's important to give justices life terms because they have to be insulated from public opinion. This is also sometimes referred to as judicial independence, that if you just give them life terms, they can do what's right and they don't have to worry about being reelected and necessarily doing what's popular, because what is right is not always what is popular, and what is popular is not always what is right. And then also they felt like, you know, in order to attract the best candidates to be potential judges, you would have to give them something pretty significant. Because to be honest, most of these people will be taking pay cuts to become judges. So the way you make it attractive for them is you give them a job for life. That's Fed 78. And then the last of the documents obviously relates to our Unit on Civil Rights. This is a letter from a Birmingham jail. The author of this document is obviously Martin Luther King. Who's the audience? Who's he writing to? If you remember, he's writing to mostly members of the white clergy and white moderates, people that have previously criticized his tactics and have continuously asked him to wait. And again, we're very critical of some of the actions that King had taken specifically in Birmingham to oppose racial justice that existed there. So some of the more prominent things you might want to know about the document itself, that King is writing in defense of what he's done, and he says like, look, we didn't just do this without lots of careful consideration and planning. That we didn't just jump to this decision to have like protests and boycotts and marches and things like that. There are actually 4 steps. We sort of studied the situation, collected facts, then we tried to negotiate, then we trained ourselves. That's what self purification is in the ways of nonviolent protest. And only then, after people refused to negotiate, did they resort to any kind of direct action. It was also written to sort of, again, answer to people like why you have to do these types of things. And his argument was that they had waited long enough and that you needed some sort of direct action to create the tension that was necessary to force the government officials to actually negotiate and then to change. Because it was clear they weren't going to negotiate and change things on their own. And then one of the key lines in this foundational document is injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. The idea that as long as there is any sort of injustice that's taking place in Birmingham or throughout the country, everyone essentially was at risk, including white moderates and the clergy and groups like that.